The psalmist says, "Look upon me and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, lest I sleep in death." Friends, we are on the cusp of our national celebrations of independence. The 4th of July marks the day during wartime that a small group of men finally, after much disagreeable discussion, agreed on a Declaration of Independence. Another 7 years would pass before the war ended, and there could be a real United States of America. Many of us here recall the sesquicentennial of 1976. The time frame from the first Fourth to now, of about 250 years, is but a blip in God's time. Our readings today span a time from prehistory, before written narratives were made, to over 2,000 years ago. In Genesis, in which we are told of God's engagement in the creation of all nature and of the development of relationship to all humanity, we are told a story of God's testing. Abraham was to be the father of a chosen nation. Would he be faithful to the tasks given? Would he be obedient to God's plan? This story reveals the seriousness of God's investment in humanity and in Abraham specifically. Our creation stories reveal human vulnerability. Created in the image and likeness of God, we too are creative. We imagine things, and through our ingenuity and handiwork, we often bring them into being. God's test of Abraham focused on obedience, and he proved worthy by setting out on the journey God directed. Abraham's young son, Isaac, was to be sacrificed on a mountain altar. Along the way, Isaac realized that they had brought no lamb for the offering. He asked his father, "Where is the lamb?" Abraham replied, "God will provide." So, in addition to obedience, the test of Abraham was of trust. The idea of sacrificing his own son, the child of his old age, by his old wife Sarah, is unthinkable. Surely Abraham trusted that God would provide a solution to his terrible dilemma. But Abraham followed God's directive right up to the last moment, right up to the line he must cross to prove his obedience and trust. The knife was raised when God intervened. We can believe that this was God's plan all along, God's hope for Abraham and for Isaac. And God provided. Abraham and Isaac made a sacrifice of the ram God gave. There was potential all along that Abraham would refuse. After all, he was only human. If so, he would not have been the first to defy God, and certainly not the last. I'm just grateful that the story leaves out Isaac's experience once bound to the altar. This is an image equivalent to any fearsome fairy tale ogre or witch preparing to devour a poor orphan child or lost princess or prince. While Isaac's potential fate may appear to foreshadow that of God's sacrifice of God's own Son, Jesus, here and now I prefer to imagine Isaac, tired out from the journey and the trek up the mountain, falling asleep as Abraham laid the altar, and snoring through Abraham's final moments of testing. For this is not a test of Isaac, it is a test of Abraham. Abraham, in his maturity, a sage elder in his tribe, was strong enough to see the test through and righteous enough for obedience and trust to prevail. God will provide, he assured Isaac with great conviction. More than a blip of time passed between Abraham and Jesus. Our gospel reading shows us another moment in God's evolving plan for humanity. The genealogy of Jesus, found at the beginning of Matthew, enumerates 28 generations between Abraham and Jesus. While likely a symbolic number, clearly much time had passed. Lineage is important. It speaks of God's intention and to an integrity of purpose, as well as adaptation to times when things don't go as planned, because as we well know, humans operate from free will. We have always had the opportunity to choose, and we do. Jesus has chosen disciples, followers who have chosen to follow the way of life and spirit that he reveals. They have been following Jesus as he went about the cities and villages, teaching and proclaiming a message of good news and healing and making free all who came to him. Leading up to our reading today, Jesus instructs his disciples with specific guidance before sending them out to do likewise, teaching and healing and casting out demons. Our passage today concludes with instructions with words about welcome and reward. Abraham's reward was favor in God's sight. The disciples' reward will be eternal life. These are the stakes at risk when defying God, when disobeying God, as Paul makes clear in the passage from the letter to the Romans. Paul uses the imagery of slavery, but not as of those being bought and sold, as in the darkest corners of our national history, but rather as one willingly choosing to subjugate oneself into a slavery destined for death. He calls it obedience to passions instead of to God. To be such a slave is to be without freedom. Yet Paul insists one can choose to leave such slavery, to choose righteousness instead. Such righteousness is the free gift of God's grace. You may have heard of Gregory Boyle, founder of Homeboy Industries, a gang intervention, rehabilitation, and reentry program that creates context and opportunity for people enslaved to the gang world to find their way to God's grace and a life of freedom. There are many other examples of such inviting opportunities. The question becomes, to whom or to what shall our obedience be given? Who or what will I welcome into my life? On this note, I draw your attention back to our present time, early July 2023. We are preparing to celebrate an independence from a past way of life for freedom to create and pursue a new way of life. We've been at it for over 250 years. How are we doing? Just as Isaac would awaken to the slaughter of the lamb God provided and would continue his growing up into the life God had given him, so must we awaken to the call God has given us and grow into the recognition of the abundance God has provided for fulfilling our call. The entire ministry of Jesus shows how to live in obedience to God through trust. And if we only look at today's instruction, we are given directions concerning welcome, and in particular, the reciprocity of welcome. Now, to be clear, Jesus is not giving instructions for the founding of a new nation or even a new religion. Recall that elsewhere, he instructs an inquirer to give to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to give God that which is God's, right down to a cup of cool water for the thirsty. The reciprocity of welcome is the sustenance of all. This is the question that, boiled down, remains for us today. Are we a welcoming people? Most of us who have been born into this country descend from ancestors who migrated here from other lands. Those earliest ancestors, in many ways, failed to reciprocate the welcome extended by the indigenous residents of this land. People who had been here creating life and rich civilization for many millennia. The new arrivals may have had good intentions, but many were asleep to the sacrifice they perpetrated on their indigenous neighbors. We today are only beginning to fully awaken to the sacrifice that was demanded of them. As Episcopalians, we are called to racial reconciliation, and part of our initiative toward this end is being spearheaded by descendants of our indigenous forefathers and foremothers. Drawing on the best of both worlds, we can belatedly welcome each other reciprocally by doing the work we are given to do. Our program, called Sacred Ground, is the essential work in our awakening process. There's a trend at large these days that seems intended to draw folks back to a 1950s way of life. Here's a snapshot of that time that I remember from my childhood. In those days, busloads of migrant Mexican families came to my small northeastern Arkansas town to pick cotton. This was my first exposure to another culture. I could also speak of my exposure to the Jim Crow of those days, but for now I focus on those migrants I can recall in my mind's eye. There was a small, dark man wearing a hat decorated with ball fringe around the wide, flat brim. I remember a woman standing on the sidewalk, nursing an infant. I'd never seen that before. Today, I know about the back-breaking, soul-draining work in those hot, dry fields, the stress on family life of frequent moves, the neglect of education, the limited health care, and other sacrifices demanded of those people far from home. Who would want to return to a time like that? Once awake to the devastation of such a lifestyle, one can never comfortably sleep on that again. Also in the 1950s, my parents and grandparents and I traveled by car to see California, to visit family that had come here to find work. Along the way, through Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona, we stopped at so-called trading posts to see the Indians and the beautiful crafts they made. Route 66 and tourist-focused trading posts largely hid the truth of the life of the indigenous descendants who by then were long forced onto reservations, carved out from the undesirable lands and kept away from those lands on which their ancestors had thrived. We, followers of Jesus' call to welcome, cannot return to such days of ignorance. The Reverend Stephen Charleston is an indigenous elder and a retired Episcopal priest and bishop who draws on his ancestral culture with its earth-centered spirituality in a book of meditations called Ladder to the Light. In the introduction, he writes, "The spiritual resilience of the North American indigenous peoples is legendary." He writes of the kiva, which is an underground sacred space entered down a ladder from an opening in its roof. This descent to a space of enlightenment contrasts starkly with towering cathedral spires pointing and drawing the eye upward. He points us to an awakening to both the light above and the light below, that deep light whose quality is nurturance, the nurturance of the womb from which we came and to which we will return as dust. Bishop Charleston invites us to awaken into the light that reconciles, that heals, that transforms. I stop now with his closing poetic reflection. A world of light. Sunrise is our banner, unfurled in a rising wind, the bright beacon of all our hopes, flying in the face of darkness, an old faith reborn, a new faith emerging, not for a few, but for all, the great tribes of life assembled beneath the single blessing, a circle of light, light within light, healing the scars of shadows, releasing the soul of every captive, welcoming the stranger, honoring the elders, a world of light spreading warmth to arms grown weary, lifting spirits to sing once more, uniting our family once again and forever. Light flowing like a river, hope beating like a drum, up and out into the fields of harvest, unafraid and always thankful, the small light in a single heart that became the morning sun.